At the time, this didn't seem important. It was introduced slowly, without debate, and most people accepted it as normal. No one felt harmed right away. The effects came later, after habits were already formed. By then, the change was everywhere, and very few people remembered how it started. There's a photograph somewhere in your parents' house, or maybe it's in yours now, of a family sitting around a table. Everyone's there. No one's looking at a screen. The food is on plates, not in wrappers. And if you look closely, you'll notice something else. No one seems to be in a hurry. That wasn't staged. That was just dinner. In 1960, the average American family sat down together for dinner 5 to 6 times per week. The meal lasted somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, not because there was more time in the day, but because that's what dinner was. A gathering point, a caesura in the day's rhythm, a moment when the household reconvened. The table wasn't just furniture, it was infrastructure. Children said it, someone said grace, or at least paused before eating. Conversations happened in the gaps between bites. How was school? What happened at work? Did you hear about the Johnsons? The talk wasn't always deep. Often it was mundane, but it was consistent. It was expected. And over years, those small exchanges accumulated into something larger, a sense of being known. Cooking was labor, yes, but it was also transmission. A mother taught a daughter how to make her grandmother's brisket. A father showed a son how to choose a melon at the market. Recipes weren't just instructions, they were family liturgy, small rituals that connected generations. You learned not only what your people ate, but how they moved through a kitchen, what they valued, what they remembered. Food carried identity. You could tell where someone's family came from by what appeared on their table. Italian households had Sunday gravy. Jewish families had challah on Friday nights. Southern tables had greens and cornbread. Mexican homes had tortillas made by hand. These weren't performances of ethnicity, they were lived culture, passed through muscle memory and taste. The kitchen itself was a different space then, not pristine, not optimized, but central. It smelled like something. Onions browning, bread baking, coffee percolating. Those smells seeped into the walls, into the furniture, into memory. Decades later, a particular scent could transport you backward, not to a specific day, but to a feeling, a presence, a time when someone was cooking for you. And the act of cooking for someone meant something specific. It meant care. It meant you were thinking about them hours before they sat down to eat. It meant you knew what they liked, what they needed, what would make them feel taken care of. It was a language that didn't require words. But that language, like all languages, required practice. It required repetition. It required being present for the transmission. And then, something shifted. The changes came in layers, each one reasonable on its own. First came convenience foods in the 50s and 60s. Canned soups, boxed mixes, frozen dinners. They were marketed as tools, not replacements. A way to save time on a busy weeknight, a backup plan. No one thought they would become the primary plan. Then came the economic shifts of the 70s and 80s. Wages stagnated. The cost of living rose. What used to require one income now required two. Women who had been entering the workforce in growing numbers were now working not as a choice, but as a necessity. That was progress in some ways. It was survival in others. But the structure of daily life didn't adjust to accommodate it. Work hours didn't shrink. Commutes didn't shorten. Schools didn't extend their hours or provide dinner. The expectation that someone would be home in the afternoon to start cooking, that invisible labor that had organized family life for generations, simply evaporated. And into that gap rushed an industry that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Fast food chains, which had been regional novelties in the 50s, became national infrastructure. By 1980, There were more than 50,000 fast food restaurants in the United States. By 2000, that number had doubled. Drive-thrus weren't just convenient, they were necessary. You could feed a family of 4 in 10 minutes for $10. No prep, no cleanup, no skill required. Microwaves, once a luxury item, became standard. The average household got one in the mid-80s. Suddenly, cooking meant 3 minutes and a button press. Frozen meals evolved from aluminum trays with mystery meat to colorful boxes with photographs that promised restaurant quality. They didn't deliver it, but they delivered something: speed. And speed became the value that organized everything else. Dinner shifted from 6 o'clock to 7, then to 8, then to whenever everyone happened to be home. The table, which had been the default gathering place, became optional. People began eating in front of the television, then at their desks, then in their cars. The family meal didn't disappear all at once. It fragmented. Different schedules, different preferences, different meals eaten alone in different rooms. By the 2000s, the average American family was sitting down together fewer than 3 times per week. And even when they did, the meal was shorter, 20 minutes, maybe less. Just long enough to consume food, not long enough for much else. Children stopped learning to cook. Why would they? The adults weren't cooking either. Home economics disappeared from most schools. Grocery stores redesigned themselves around the perimeter versus center aisle logic. Fresh food on the edges, processed food in the middle, and most families never left the middle. Shopping became a matter of grabbing boxes, not selecting ingredients. The recipes that had been passed down began to skip generations. A grandmother might still make her mother's dish on holidays, but her daughter didn't learn it, and her granddaughter wouldn't even know it existed. Food became something you bought, not something you knew how to make. And with that shift came a subtle but profound loss: the ability to feed yourself and the people you love without depending on a corporation to do it for you. The family dinner wasn't just about food. That was never the point. It was about time. Unmonetized, unoptimized, unmarketable time. Time that couldn't be sped up or skipped. You had to sit there. You had to wait for others to finish. You had to listen even when you didn't particularly want to. Especially then. Child psychologists had been saying it for decades. Families who eat together regularly produce children with better academic outcomes, lower rates of substance abuse, lower rates of depression, and stronger communication skills. Not because there was magic in the mashed potatoes, but because the dinner table was where children learned to exist in a shared space with people who weren't their peers, where they practiced conversation with adults, where they absorbed, through sheer repetition, the idea that they were part of something larger than themselves. That structure didn't just vanish, it was replaced. Teenagers who used to sit at a table and half listen to their parents talk about boring adult things were now in their rooms, online, building identities in spaces their parents couldn't see. Younger children, who once had no choice but to engage with family, were handed tablets to keep them quiet. The phrase "family time" started to mean watching the same movie in the same room, which wasn't the same thing at all. And parents, exhausted from working longer hours for stagnant wages, from managing schedules that required spreadsheet-level coordination, from the constant cognitive load of modern life, didn't have the energy to fight about it. It was easier to let everyone eat what they wanted, when they wanted. Easier to stop insisting on things that felt outdated, that no one else seemed to be doing anymore. But easier didn't mean better. Divorce rates, which had been climbing since the 70s, continued to rise. There were many reasons for that: legal, cultural, economic, but one thread ran through the research. Couples who stopped eating together stopped talking. Not dramatically, gradually. They became roommates managing a household instead of partners building a life. Loneliness, which had been a relatively minor public health concern in the mid-20th century, became epidemic by the 2000s. People reported having fewer close friends, fewer people they could call in a crisis, less connection to their neighbors, their communities, their extended families. Some of that was geographic mobility. Some of it was technology. But some of it was just the slow erosion of daily rituals that forced people into each other's presence. Rituals like dinner. Children growing up in the 90s and 2000s reported feeling less close to their parents than previous generations had. Not because their parents loved them less, but because there were fewer opportunities for the kind of low-stakes, repeated interactions that build intimacy. The car ride to school became silent, everyone on their phones. The walk to the park became a scheduled playdate. The hour after school, which used to involve a snack and a conversation about the day, became screen time. And food itself changed meaning. It stopped being a gift and became a transaction. You didn't eat your mother's cooking, you ate whatever was in the fridge. You didn't share a meal. You grabbed something on the way to practice. Eating became a private act, a functional necessity, something you did to stop being hungry. The social dimension faded. People born after 1990 were less likely to know how to roast a chicken, bake bread, or make a sauce from scratch than any generation in modern history, not because they were less intelligent, but because they'd never seen it done. Their parents hadn't been taught, because their parents had been taught that cooking was optional, a hobby, something you did if you were into that sort of thing. But it had never been a hobby. It had been the way humans took care of each other.
There's a specific kind of nostalgia that people feel now when they see old photographs of family dinners. Not for the food, most of them don't even remember what was on the plate. They're nostalgic for the fact that everyone was there, that the moment existed long enough to be photographed, that no one was somewhere else, doing something else, already thinking about the next thing. Researchers started noticing something in the 2010s. Even when families tried to reinstate regular dinners, they struggled. Not because they didn't want to, but because the infrastructure had been dismantled. Everyone's schedules had diverged too far. Work demanded evening meetings. Schools scheduled activities that ran until 8 p.m. Sports practices happened during dinner hours. The entire social architecture had reorganized itself around the assumption that dinner didn't matter. And after a generation or two of that, people stopped expecting it. Children who grew up without regular family meals didn't insist on them when they became parents. They didn't miss what they'd never had. To them, eating separately was normal. Grabbing takeout was normal. The idea of cooking a meal from scratch every night felt not just difficult but arbitrary, like insisting on writing letters by hand in the age of email. But something was being lost that was harder to name than cooking skills or nutritional knowledge. It was the experience of being porous to each other, of being in a space where you couldn't fully control the interaction, where your sibling might say something annoying, where your parent might tell an embarrassing story, where you had to negotiate, compromise, tolerate. The dinner table was where children learned that other people had needs and moods and bad days, and that you dealt with that not by logging off, but by staying present.
It was also where parents learned who their children were becoming. You couldn't track that through grades or test scores. You had to hear it in the offhand comments, the jokes, the questions they asked when they felt safe enough to ask them. That kind of knowledge required time and repetition. It required boring, uneventful evenings where nothing remarkable happened except that everyone was there. And when those evenings stopped happening, a kind of mutual illegibility set in. Parents looked at their teenagers and didn't recognize them. Teenagers looked at their parents and saw strangers who worked a lot and seemed tired.
Siblings became people you lived with but didn't really know. The family became a logistical unit, people who shared an address and a last name, who coordinated schedules and split bills, but who weren't quite in each other's lives in the way previous generations had been. Therapists began seeing a pattern. Adult clients in their 20s and 30s who described their childhoods as fine. No abuse, no neglect, nothing dramatic, but who felt a deep, inexplicable loneliness. Who didn't know how to stay in relationships. Who struggled with intimacy, not because they feared it, but because they'd never learned what it looked like in its mundane, daily form. They'd been raised in homes that were materially comfortable, but relationally sparse, where everyone was busy, where love was assumed, but not necessarily felt, because feeling love requires presence, and presence requires time, and time was the one thing no one seemed to have.
There's a question that doesn't get asked enough. What happens to a society when families stop eating together? Not in a moral panic way, not in a back to the 50s way, just functionally. What changes? Culture stops transmitting the same way. Language, idiom, family stories, the little details that make you part of a specific lineage, all of that gets passed along in moments of low-stakes repetition. Your grandfather tells the same story for the 100th time. Your mother mentions how her mother used to do something. You complain about the same thing your father complained about at your age. These aren't grand lessons, they're ambient knowledge, but they add up to a sense of continuity. When those moments stop happening, each generation starts from scratch. Values become harder to transmit too. Not the big ones. Most parents manage to convey that stealing is wrong and kindness is good. But the subtle ones. How to apologize. How to sit with discomfort. How to have a conversation with someone you're mad at. How to be part of a group where you're not the center. Children used to learn that at the dinner table, in the friction of daily life. Now they learn it, or don't, in the curated, performative spaces of social media. And food itself stops being a language. There's a reason every culture on Earth has specific foods for specific moments. Weddings, funerals, New Year's, birthdays. Food marks time. It connects the body to memory. When you eat your grandmother's recipe, you're not just eating, you're participating in a continuity that stretches backward and forward. You're saying, I come from people. I belong to something. But if you don't know your grandmother's recipe, if food is just fuel, just a commodity, just something that arrives in a bag, then that connection breaks. You're unmoored. You're eating, but you're not fed. Anthropologists call it commensality, the practice of eating together. It's one of the oldest human behaviors. Across every culture, across all of history, humans have gathered to share food. It's how we build trust, how we mark belonging, how we turn strangers into allies and allies into family. The modern world didn't set out to destroy that. It just made it inconvenient, and then optional, and then rare.
There are families now who are trying to bring it back, who block off dinner time on the calendar like it's a meeting that can't be moved, who turn off phones and televisions, who cook, even when it's hard, even when no one's in the mood, who sit together and enforce the kind of low-grade boredom that used to be the background noise of family life. It's harder than it used to be. The culture doesn't support it. Schedules don't align. Children complain. Teenagers resist, and some nights it feels performative, like trying to recreate something that only worked when it was unconscious. But some things only survive if someone insists on them. The families in those old photographs didn't think they were doing anything special. They were just eating dinner. but they were also building something that took decades to become visible. A shared history. A set of people who knew each other not as profiles or roles, but as the complicated, annoying, beloved humans they actually were. That wasn't automatic. It required showing up again and again, even when it was boring, especially then. What happened to families over decades wasn't a single catastrophe. It was 1,000 small compromises. 1,000 moments when convenience won out over connection, when speed won out over presence, when efficiency won out over the slow, invisible work of staying in each other's lives. And the cost of that didn't show up right away. It showed up later, in the gaps, in the loneliness, in the sense that something important had been lost, even if no one could quite name what it was. This was just one way it happened. There were others.